Now that you've had a chance to work through the lesson on page 1, I want to go back and identify the correct vocabulary for the types of bias. So for number 1, there were 300 people contacted who should have been in the survey, but they were only people that had a landline phone. So in that case, we would say that this is considered undercoverage because there might be some groups of the population left out, and those would be people who don't have a landline phone. So we're going to write down that this is actually undercoverage when groups are left out. For number 2, there was a random sample of 100, but only 40 actually returned the responses. So for that part, we would actually say this is non-response. So even though they were selected to be in the sample, they actually didn't get into the sample because they didn't respond. Now, in this case, you might also have people who respond, but they may not be telling the truth because they don't want to feel bad for not doing the homework. So I've written here that students may lie and say they did homework even if they didn't. And in that case, that would be considered response. And that's just where you get inaccurate replies. And that's another type of bias. For number 3, we have the Boy Scout who wore his uniform and visited people in the neighborhood and asked whether or not they supported the Boy Scouts. So in this case, since he's wearing the uniform, it's possible that he could be influencing their responses. So again, they may not tell the truth of whether they do or don't support the Boy Scouts. And it's likely that they would tell him they do because he's dressed in uniform and also because he knows them. So when we move to the next page, after you've gone through the responses and identified and kind of talked about each part on page 1, you want to go ahead and identify and really formalize those definitions. So for the first one, I'm going to look at undercoverage. That was the first type of bias that we identified. And in this case, undercoverage could be when some members of the population cannot or are less likely to be chosen. So for our example, that was really number 1 for the landlines. Not everybody had a landline, so they couldn't be chosen. The second type was non-response bias. And this is when an individual is selected they decide not to participate, or maybe they can't be reached. And then the third type of bias we identified was response. And this is where it would lead to a pattern of inaccurate responses. This could be due to the interviewer. So the Boy Scout who is dressed in the uniform might influence the response. It could be the wording of the question. It might be leading some people to an answer, or it could be confusing, so they don't answer it the way it was expected to be answered. Or people might just lie and not tell the truth because they don't want to feel bad or they don't want any repercussions. Now, back to one other thing that we didn't talk about, which is voluntary response. And this is still a type of response bias, but voluntary is different. Because when you have voluntary response, it means that maybe a survey was sent out and people actually choose to send it back. And so those people, voluntarily respond, which is a little bit different than non-response because some people may not be able to be reached, or they simply just do not give a response, or in the case of the landlines, they might even hang up. So, what I would like for you guys to do next, after you have copied down the big ideas, is go through the check your understanding. There's just a few questions here, and then we will move on to the next lesson.